There is one name that Mel Brooks refused to speak kindly of for 70 years. Not a rival director, not a jealous studio executive. One of Hollywood's most beloved, most decorated, most photographed leading men. And Brooks built an entire film around exposing him. By the time you reach the end of this list, you'll understand exactly why. Because the man at the very top of this ranking sat across a commissary table from Mel Brooks in 1973, read the Blazing Saddles script overnight, handed it back the next morning, and told Brooks he couldn't do the film, but he'd be first in line to watch it. Hit subscribe now, because we're about to go through 6 names, and by the time we reach number 1, you'll want to know who else made this list. Who was Mel Brooks, and why did he have the receipts? For 7 decades, Mel Brooks worked from inside the American entertainment industry as one of its most outspoken Jewish-American comedic voices. His career began in 1950, when he joined Sid Caesar's writer's room on Your Show of Shows, a room that would go on to produce some of the most influential comedy writers of the 20th century. It continued through The Producers in 1967, through the run of satirical films that defined the 1970s and 1980s, and stretched all the way into his 2021 memoir, All About Me, and the candid interviews he continued giving well into his 90s. Across that 70-year run, Brooks held a vantage point on Hollywood's racism that almost no other working comedian of his generation occupied. He had served in the United States Army during the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. He had watched the Hollywood Blacklist tear apart the careers of Jewish and progressive writers he worked alongside. And he spent the most productive years of his creative life making films specifically designed to expose the racism his own industry had spent 50 years quietly protecting. The clearest example of that mission arrived in 1974, with Blazing Saddles, arguably the most direct act of comedic resistance to Hollywood racism the studio system had ever produced. Brooks co-wrote the script with Richard Pryor. In a writer's room, Brooks later described, only half joking, as feeling like a drunken brawl. Pryor was Brooks's original choice to play Sheriff Bart, the black lead character whose entire narrative function was to dismantle the racial conventions of the Western genre from the inside. The film went on to become the highest-grossing comedy of 1974 and remains one of the most studied satirical films in American cinema. So here's the list: 6 names, 6 documented cases, starting with number 6. Number 6. Mickey Rooney, the beloved star in Yellowface. For 7 decades, Mickey Rooney was one of the most enduring child stars in American entertainment history. The diminutive Brooklyn-born performer topped the box office for 3 consecutive years, from 1939 to 1941, on the strength of his Andy Hardy films. His musical numbers opposite Judy Garland defined a whole generation of MGM family entertainment. By the time he died in 2014 at age 93, his filmography stretched across roughly 360 credits and 7 decades of work. But 1961 produced the single most documented racist performance of Rooney's career. His portrayal of Mr. Iwai Yunioshi, the Japanese upstairs neighbor in Breakfast at Tiffany's, opposite Audrey Hepburn's Holly Golightly. Rooney's performance has entered the historical record as one of the most aggressive examples of yellowface in mainstream Hollywood cinema. He wore heavy facial prosthetics, including taped eyelids and prominent false teeth, and delivered an exaggerated, stereotyped accent, the entire comedic mechanism of the role built on the same racial caricature the studio system had spent decades enforcing against Asian American performers. And critics noticed at the time, not just in hindsight. The New York Times review in 1961 described the character as broadly exotic. James Powers, writing for The Hollywood Reporter, called the role a caricature that would be offensive to many. Even the film's own director, Blake Edwards, later expressed public regret about the casting, telling interviewers before his death in 2010 that he would give anything to recast the part. Rooney's own response, when the criticism eventually caught up to him decades later, is worth sitting with. In a 2008 interview, he described himself as genuinely shocked to learn Asian American activists had called the role racist, insisting that nobody had complained in the more than 40 years since the film's release. There is no real apology on record from Rooney in the remaining 6 years of his life. Just a defensive insistence that the performance had been a comedy choice, misread by audiences who, in his telling, simply lacked the sense of humor to appreciate it. Brooks built his career, in direct contrast, on exposing exactly this kind of racial caricature rather than deploying it. The same child star, whose Andy Hardy films had defined wholesome American adolescence, had also delivered one of the most documented yellowface performances in mainstream film history. The same year, John F. Kennedy took office, and defended it, without apology, for the rest of his life. Number 5. Adolphe Menjou, the dapper star who named names. For 4 decades, Adolphe Menjou was Hollywood's most impeccably dressed character actor, his tailored suits and pencil mustache making him one of the most photographed, best-dressed men in America across the 1930s and 40s. He earned an Oscar nomination for The Front Page in 1931 and delivered memorable supporting work in Stage Door, A Star is Born, and Paths of Glory. But the documented record of Menjou's politics places him among the most openly white supremacist figures in mid-century Hollywood. His 1948 autobiography, It Took 9 Tailors, laid out political views that contemporary readers immediately recognized as drawing on the racial assumptions of the early 20th century American South. Menjou was a founding member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals from its establishment in 1944, working alongside John Wayne, Walt Disney, Cecil B, DeMille, Hedda Hopper, Ginger Rogers, Ronald Reagan, Ward Bond, and Ayn Rand to coordinate the political machinery behind the Hollywood Blacklist that would destroy the careers of progressive writers and performers through the late 1940s and 1950s. In October 1947, Menjou appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee as a friendly witness, one of a small group of Hollywood figures who used their congressional testimony to name colleagues, setting off the blacklist that would end those careers. His testimony went further than most. He famously told the committee he would move to Texas if communists ever took over Hollywood, because Texans know how to handle them. Language his contemporaries widely understood as an allusion to the lynching tradition institutionalized across the American South. Brooks began writing for Your Show of Shows in 1950. At the exact moment the blacklist Menjou had helped build was actively destroying the careers of Jewish progressive writers and performers across the New York television industry that employed Brooks's own generation. The mustachioed, tailored fixture of Hollywood social life had spent his actual political career helping construct the machinery that targeted his Jewish colleagues directly. Before we move to number 4, if you're finding this rundown useful, take a second and hit that subscribe button. This channel breaks down the documented history behind old Hollywood's biggest names every week. And the next entry is arguably the most foundational figure on this entire list. Number 4. Cecil B. DeMille, the studio system's founding bigot. No name in the documented record of Hollywood's institutional racism runs deeper than Cecil B. DeMille, because DeMille didn't just work within the studio system. He helped build its visual conventions and production infrastructure. Across a 5-decade directing career spanning 1914 through 1956, DeMille directed roughly 70 films, including both the 1923 and 1956 versions of the Ten Commandments, along with Cleopatra and Samson and Delilah, the biblical epics that established the template for spectacle filmmaking in American cinema. DeMille co-founded the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals in 1944, placing him at the institutional center of the blacklist apparatus during the years it was actively being constructed. His leadership within the Directors Guild of America extended that institutional politics into a documented campaign against integrating the Guild's membership. most notably his sustained 1950 effort against director Joseph Mankiewicz, one of the most public attempts to enforce ideological and racial conformity on the directing profession itself. Brooks took a direct swing at DeMille in Blazing Saddles, a line noting that a character had killed more men than Cecil B. DeMille. It's a joke, but it encodes something real. Brooks's generational understanding that the sheer body count baked into DeMille's biblical spectacles sat in direct contradiction to the moral seriousness those films claimed to embody. The record of how DeMille's productions treated Black and Asian American performers tells the same story. His biblical epics consistently cast white performers in racially significant roles the historical record would have called for actors of color to play. And DeMille's institutional power, as one of the founding architects of the studio system, extended those casting habits into the wider conventions the rest of the industry inherited. A director whose religious spectacles helped define American epic cinema spent his actual career building the institutional infrastructure that excluded his own progressive, integrationist colleagues from the industry his work had helped create. Number 3. John Ford, the director who made the racism visible. For 50 years, John Ford defined the visual language of the American Western, directing roughly 140 films across a career that spans nearly the entire history of American cinema. He won a record 4 Best Director Oscars for The Informer, The Grapes of Wrath, How Green Was My Valley, and The Quiet Man, and his collaborations with John Wayne produced arguably the most influential body of work the Western genre has ever seen. Ford's relationship to American racism is documented from the very start of his career. As a young man, he appeared on screen in D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation in 1915, one of the Klansmen riding to the rescue in the film's climactic final act. Ford's participation is documented in Joseph McBride's authoritative 2001 biography, Searching for John Ford, where Ford himself reportedly confirmed his involvement to McBride. That early appearance carries symbolic weight across the next 50 years of his directing career. Blazing Saddles, in 1974, was Brooks's direct comedic confrontation with the genre Ford had spent 5 decades constructing. Brooks shot in locations Ford had used, deployed the widescreen format Ford had popularized, and built the entire production as a satirical inversion of the racial conventions Ford's films had helped normalize. From the demeaning caricatures in Judge Priest, 1934, and Steamboat Round the Bend, 1935, to the Native American depictions running through Stagecoach and The Searchers, to the well-documented moment in 1962's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where Ford directed Woody Strode's character to be addressed on screen as Boy. A 4-time Oscar-winning director who appeared as a Klansman in 1915, directed demeaning caricatures in the 1930s, helped define the visual grammar of Native American savagery for the Western genre, and was still directing his black lead actor to be called Boy at the height of the civil rights movement. Number 2. Ronald Reagan, the future president who built the Blacklist. For 3 decades, Ronald Reagan worked inside the Hollywood studio system, first as a contract player at Warner Brothers, later fronting General Electric Theater, appearing in more than 50 films across his acting career. He also served multiple terms as president of the Screen Actors Guild from 1947 to 1952, and again from 1959 to 1960, using that institutional position during the most consequential years of the Hollywood Blacklist to shape the careers of working actors across the industry. Reagan's specific role in the Blacklist came to light through FBI files obtained under the Freedom of Information Act by journalist Seth Rosenfeld, published in his 2012 book, Subversives: The FBI's War on Student Radicals and Reagan's Rise to Power. Those files documented Reagan's role as a confidential FBI informant, beginning shortly after his election as SAG president in April 1947, when he met with 2 FBI agents and named 8 Hollywood figures he identified as Communist Party members. The SAG executive director, working under Reagan's direction in the years that followed, is documented as having helped FBI agents identify dozens more Hollywood figures who entered the Bureau's surveillance files. One of those names was character actor J. Edward Bromberg, who reportedly asked not to be required to testify before HUAC due to a documented heart condition, was called to testify regardless, was subsequently blacklisted, and died of a heart attack roughly 6 months after the blacklist ended his career. Reagan's own October 1947 friendly witness testimony before HUAC lent his SAG presidential authority to the institutional case for the blacklist apparatus, the same machinery that was destroying the careers of Brooks's progressive Jewish colleagues during his Your Show of Shows years. The documented record extends into Reagan's later political career too. A 1971 phone call to President Richard Nixon, declassified by the National Archives in 2019, captured then-Governor Reagan describing African diplomats in explicitly racist terms. A recording whose 2019 release generated substantial press coverage at the time. 2 documented chapters, separated by decades, of the same man's recorded attitudes across a public life that spanned Brooks's entire career. Number 1. John Wayne, the white supremacist Brooks confronted in person. No documented figure in old Hollywood's golden age history sat more directly at the center of Mel Brooks's professional life than John Wayne. Wayne represented the absolute summit of the racial mythology Blazing Saddles had been built to confront, and Brooks's own 1973 encounter with Wayne over a casting offer remains one of the most telling meetings between 2 men who represented opposite poles of an entire generation's argument about Hollywood racism. In May 1971, Playboy magazine published an interview that stands as one of the most explicit white supremacist statements any major Hollywood star ever gave on the record. Wayne told the magazine directly that he believed in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility, that he did not believe in handing authority to people he considered irresponsible, and that he had no issue with how the American West had been taken from Native Americans, because, in his words, they had been selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. The interview reached millions of readers, and Wayne never retracted any of it across the remaining 8 years of his life, up to his death in 1979. 2 years later, in 1973, Brooks personally offered Wayne the role of the Waco Kid in Blazing Saddles during a meeting at the Warner Brothers commissary. Brooks handed Wayne the script to read overnight. Wayne returned it the next day and told Brooks the material was too dirty for his audience, but that he'd be first in line to see it once it opened. The exchange is documented in Brooks's 2021 memoir, All About Me, in a 2016 interview Brooks gave about the film's production, and across multiple journalistic accounts that have preserved the story over the decades. That interaction captures the entire generational gap with striking clarity. Wayne's public white supremacy, on one side, and Brooks's deliberate satirical confrontation of it on the other. And the fact that Wayne could find the film funny without apparently recognizing that its entire purpose was to mock the racial worldview his own public statements had defended. Wayne's founding role in the 1944 Motion Picture Alliance, his sustained financial and political backing of the Blacklist apparatus across the following 15 years, and his later public alignment with the political coalition that opposed 1960s civil rights legislation round out a documented public record spanning decades. The actor who defined American masculine cinema for generations spent his actual life as an outspoken public white supremacist, and became the direct, deliberate subject of the most pointed satirical film of Brooks's career. 6 names Mel Brooks refused to let history forget. Mickey Rooney, the beloved child star whose unrepentant 1961 yellowface performance he never apologized for. Adolphe Menjou, the best-dressed character actor whose 1948 memoir openly embraced white supremacist politics. Cecil B. DeMille, the biblical epic director whose Christian image concealed his role building the institutional machinery of the Blacklist. John Ford, the 4-time Oscar winner whose westerns built the visual language of American cinematic racism for decades. Ronald Reagan, the future president whose SAG presidency and FBI work helped dismantle the careers of Brooks's own colleagues. And John Wayne, the Western icon whose 1971 Playboy interview delivered the most explicit white supremacist statement any major Hollywood star ever gave, and whose 1973 meeting with Brooks captured the entire gap between American comedy's confrontation with racism and the mythology Wayne spent his career defending. Brooks confronted every one of them. In Blazing Saddles in 1974, in All About Me in 2021, and in the interviews across his final decades where he never softened his judgment of the men whose politics shaped the industry his generation entered as outsiders. Which of these 6 shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and if you want more documented, sourced deep dives into old Hollywood's hidden history, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're going even further back into the studio era's most buried stories. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.